Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/vmspod or paypal.me/vmspod to make a one-time or recurring donation and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. You ready for a bonus episode this week? I am. I figure I am just bristling with neurotic energy right now for God knows what reason. So rather than wait to post this one for a few weeks because I got a bunch of other guest commitments, I kind of figured I'd just bring it to you now. So our guest this time is Jeff Trexler. Now, Jeff is the interim director of the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, or CBLDF. CBLDF is a nonprofit organization that, per its charter, is dedicated to defending constitutional rights relating to speech and press and to assist with relief from arbitrary discrimination by authorities concerning or relating to the public's access to comic books and other comic publications. That's sort of a mouthful. But if I just said they help with First Amendment cases related to comics, that would seem too limiting. CBLDF has done important work over the decades, helping defend cartoonists and comic shops from legal persecution, working with past guest and comics legend Paul Mavridis on a landmark tax case in California, defending libraries and other institutions as they battle against censorship, and a lot of other stuff. But earlier this year, the CBLDF's longtime director resigned after long documented episodes of sexual harassment resurfaced, and other episodes of abuse came to light. With his departure and serious questions about the oversight conducted by CBLDF's board over the years, there were questions as to whether the fund should be dissolved. There were also some decisions on the part of the fund over the recent years about cases they would or wouldn't get involved in that also created a stir in the industry. But instead of folding, CBLDF's board brought in Jeff as the interim director in August with the mission of not just helping rebuild CBLDF, but also changing how the fund works with the comics industry and other parties, while also creating a better, inclusive, anti-harassment environment that can be a model for other organizations. Now, Jeff and I met last January at the memorial service for Tom Spurgeon that we held in New York City. He introduced himself, and we had a really good conversation about comics and IP law and nonprofits and Tom, who was a really important person to both of us. So when I saw that Jeff had taken this role as interim director at CBLDF after this big crisis, I was interested in talking to him about it. Also, as a guy who heads up a very different nonprofit, mine is we'll talk about it during the episode, I run a 501c6, which is a nonprofit business league. CBLDF is a 501c3, which is a charitable organization. Anyway, I was interested in Jeff's perspective on how organizations evolve, how they can become sclerotic, and plenty more about how these sorts of systems work, and anything I could mine him for on how to make sure my trade association continues to grow now it's been 6+ years. But anyway, that means there are some inside baseball portions of the conversation, but seriously, not too many. Jeff also asked me a few questions about my life, so as is my wont, I prattle on a bit. But the important thing is, I hope that the people, if you're listening, that the people who were harassed by the previous CBLDF director, that you don't treat this conversation as a sign that, I take any of that lightly, or that I think the fund is more important than what they went through. The reports I read about this case were harrowing, and I know they went on for years and years. I remember when they first broke in, 2005, 2006. And people who suffered from that have every right to say that CBLDF should fold, that it didn't do enough to protect its staff, that its mission is corrupt. I understand all that. I'm not in a position to affect it one way or the other, but I do think Jeff is almost uniquely qualified to help the fund move forward and to reckon with its past at the same time. So here's his bio. Jeff Trexler is a longtime member of the comics community as well as an attorney and ethics advisor. He currently serves as CBLDF's interim executive director, bringing expertise that he developed through his work advising nonprofit organizations, media companies, and fashion brands. Prior to joining CBLDF, Jeff served as associate director of the Fashion Law Institute, where his work on ethics issues included advising government officials on sexual harassment legal reform. He is a member of the Ethics Committee at Caring Americas and also served on the board of the Museum of Comics and Cartoon Art. In addition to creating the fashion ethics course at Fordham Law School, Jeff has taught at Yale, SMU, Pace University, and St. Louis University. He has also been part of dozens of panels at Comic-Cons and continuing legal education programs. Jeff holds a JD from Yale Law School and a PhD in American Religious History from Duke University, and he is admitted to the U.S. Supreme Court and New York bars. Jeff's favorite comic book sequence is from the last issue of Grant Morrison's run of the Doom Patrol. Quote, "There is another world. There is a better world. Well, there must be." You can find Jeff's writing on comics and the law at The Beat, tcj.com, and via the Wayback Machine, blog at Newsarama. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Jeff Trexler. Tell me about your role at CBLDF, what you're doing there, what the interim is going to mean, and shoot, go ahead.
Okay, terrific. Just for a little bit of background, I'm an attorney. I'm an attorney who has, for much of his entire conscious life, I've read comic books, and I've also been obsessed with design. Those are two of the things I've been interested in since I was a kid. We can get into all of that later. But for now, with respect to the CBLDF, the one thing I haven't done for much of my career is First Amendment law. I've written about it, and I know that for a good part of the CBLDF's history, it was focused on the First Amendment. A lot of it was directed towards obscenity or making sure that books could be sold from bookstores and clerks from being sent to jail and that sort of thing, which was great, and there were a lot of great lawyers involved in it. What I've been focused on in my career has been organizations, particularly nonprofit organizations, my area of specialty since I went to law school. It was the reason I went to law school. So I followed the CBLDF from afar with an eye toward that. Sort of how is it working as an organization? How's it functioning? How is it relating to its community? What's its identity? What are the ethics and that sort of thing? And what I noticed over the summer was that it was suffering a fate that a lot of organizations have suffered over the years, and that was it. Organizations tend to get wrapped up in themselves. They emerge out of communities. They have this organic connection with their community. They're answering community needs. But then over time, they become sort of this self-sufficient entity with its own sense of mission, with its own sense of trying to survive. And that, as much as anything, was responsible for what happened to the CBLDF this summer. The proximate cause was the harassment issue, which is a very serious issue, and that's also something I've done a lot of work on behind the scenes. But there was also this deeper problem in that there was this increasing disconnect between the organization and what the comics community thought it was and thought it represented and thought it should do, and what it was actually doing. And over time, it just hit a crisis point. What my role is to help rebuild the organization from the ground up. What I'm trying to do is rebuild the connection to the community. Ethics are an absolutely key part of that. We are, of course, going to be dealing with the harassment issue and ethics codes and a number of other things in terms of accountability, in terms of making sure that it is, instead of being sort of a model of ethics gone wrong, a model of how to do ethics right. But beyond that, we're going to be thinking about ways to redesign the organization to make sure that it expresses now what it expressed back in 1986 when it was first founded. That is something that is emerging out of and responsive to the needs of the comics community.
And how do you think the foundation's evolved from those early days? I mean, I remember the late 80s, the Edwin Meese era. I'm not that old, but, I remember not being able to get Playboy. And the First Amendment issues leading into the 90s with Mike Diana and situations like that. There's clear purposes and a clear cultural mission for CBLDF. How did you see that evolving over the decades, I guess?
Well, when the organization started, there are a couple different ways a nonprofit can start. One way a nonprofit can start is that you have a vision of a founder. The founder is way ahead of the rest of society, but they inspire people to join with them, and over time, the organization builds. And there are a number of organizations and they're great. But there are other organizations where the community comes together to solve a problem, and then they realize that, hey, we could keep doing this in a systematic way in terms of bringing our money together, bringing our talents together, and solve problems that are recurring throughout the community with the nonprofit as the hub for that problem solving. And that's how the CBLDF evolved. You had the Friendly Franks case. It was involved magazine, things that we now wouldn't think of as obscene.
I know. There are things that we look back like, really, they cared about that.
Yeah, but it was the 80s, and so, but you're dealing with you're dealing with legal action where people can suffer in some very serious ways. You have the state bringing its power against this comic shop. So the community comes together to raise money to, hire a lawyer, and it was actually a Playboy lawyer they hired, a lawyer who worked with Playboy on First Amendment issues, Bert Joseph, to help this comic shop. And they realized, Dennis Kitchen realizes, hey, as he's spearheading this thing, that legal issues have been a recurring concern in the comics community. Wouldn't it be great if we took the money and we took the organizational resources that we put together to create a legal entity, and just keep doing this over time? The early years were really interesting because it's, some of it's obscenity. They're dealing with tax issues. It was really a number of different issues coming together in the CBLDF because when you think about what law meant to comics, it wasn't just about censorship. I mean, censorship, again, that was a big issue. But a lot of it's about access, and a lot of it's about personal freedom. So people want to be able to express themselves, and people want their material to be out there for other people to read, to see, to be able to sell them, and to make money from those books. So freedom of contract was an issue. Access to the marketplace was an issue. But over time, I think what happened is it ends up getting ossified with sort of, again, this proximate cause, with the immediate issue. And it tends to be seen as what one might conceive of as sort of like the ACLU, just but for comic books. So it's just a pure First Amendment organization without any connection to the reason why legal issues were meant so much to people in the comics community, because it's their livelihoods. It's a connection to who they are. As individuals and as a group. So again, in terms of what we're trying to do, we're trying to get back to that. We're trying to recapture that. It was a long evolution, but in some respects, it was an evolution that I think a number of organizations have gone through. It was something that looked very familiar to me.
Sure. I mean, this will be weird. I'm a 501c6 as opposed to a C3, like a CBLDF. I run a pharmaceutical industry trade association. We came into existence with one major goal. We were kind of sure there was other stuff, but we didn't really know. And once we achieved the major goal about 3 years into our existence, it turned out, yeah, there's enough to keep me gainfully employed for quite a while, right up through COVID, in fact, because the guys I represent are now need, help liaising with the feds and other institutions. So I get the where things can become sclerotic and where you can continue to find new areas and new, regions or sectors to cover. Are there aspects of CBLDF's charter that are sort of restrictive in that respect as a tax-exempt organization, or are there simply things that, you wish the foundation was allowed to pursue, but it's sort of outside the purview?
Well, the way I see it, there's a way the charter was interpreted, and there's the way the charter can be read. So it's funny you mentioned 501c6, because that's actually what I was teaching last night in my ethics class. I love 501c6s. I know for most of your listeners are going, oh my God, 501c6? It's the Internal Revenue Code. What about that? But the relationship between trade associations and charities, trade associations and antitrust, all these things, it's marvelous. It's very interesting stuff. There are a number of ethical issues that have to be dealt with. So, but getting back to your original question about mission, this is something that I thought about a lot before I even approached the CBLDF to help them out, because I wanted to make sure that the vision that I had for the organization aligned, and the memory I had from the organization back to the 80s. Remember, I've been reading comics and reading about the comics business since the 1970s.
Because we're old.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I can remember as a very little child, some of my earliest memories are watching the Batman 1960 TV show in its original run.
Wow.
And
I'm sorry, wow, with a big sound effect.
Exactly. Little jagged things in the balloon and an exclamation point. Exactly. That's exactly it. And that show was so key. I'm going to get to Mission in a second, but that show was so key to me because, when I was a little kid, you think of Batman and Marshall McLuhan, sort of two things that shaped my life, because that TV show, I was interviewed, and how kids make things up. It was making sense of the world, but this was how I understood things when I was a very little child. But when I went to school, kindergarten, first grade, I kind of stood out in some ways, and so I was interviewed for a master's thesis that one of the school's teachers was doing. And they were asking me about how I saw the world. And what I tried to explain to them was that when you watch the Batman TV show, sort of the early memory I have of reading was the Batman TV show would come on and they would sing Batman, be the word Batman. They'd sing Batman. And there'd be a picture of the bat logo. And it was this epiphany that I had, that those letters came together in this word, which was a sound, which was the picture. Word, picture, sound were all one. And try being, like 7 years old and trying to explain this to a teacher. Word, picture, sound, they're all one. Really, trust me. But part of the reason for the freakiness, other than just my obsession with comics and how sound and picture and letters could combine, was my grandfather had this pile of books and 2 books out in the garage, and I learned to read from a very, very young age. And 2 of the books that I got, and this had been in the 1960s, and I'm really small tyke, were Understanding Media and The Medium is the Massage by Marshall McLuhan. Initially because I loved the pictures. And then I just read them and reread them and reread them, just like I reread All in Color for a Dime and Batman from the 30s to the 70s and all the comic stuff. And Jules Pfeiffer's, great comic book heroes. And so Marshall McLuhan and all at onceness and the way that media shapes sensation, the sensory perception, all that stuff. That's kind of the warp and woof of how I see life, because that's how I saw it when I was 5, 6, 7 years old. So it's being able to see how everything connects, being able to see how media relate to the way people interact, the way that people interact with their environment. That's absolutely key to me, and to find connections that may among things that may otherwise seem separate. Those are absolutely key. So when I thought of the CBLDF and its mission, one of the things that baffled me was that it was an organization with legal in the title, was an organization that was doing tax work. The only time I interacted with it in an official capacity was in the 90s when I was a law clerk. There was a thing out in California where they talked about a tax case they were doing there.
I recorded with Paul Mavridis.
Exactly.
I did an episode with Paul a few years ago. Yeah,
exactly. So it was exactly that case. And I, at the time, was a young tax lawyer, because that's what you did if you were in nonprofits. I was fascinated by this stuff. Fascinated by sales tax and 501c6s. I'm trying to reach new lows in your guests here, Gil, in terms of interest that will have any kind of appeal. But in terms of the mission, it seemed to me that the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund should be a place where everybody could come together, where if you had contract issues, you had intellectual property issues, if you had anything connected to comics, because it's so organic. I mean, when you think about the founding myth of comic books, the modern comic book industry, you're going back to the Siegel case, right? The creation of Superman. You have the superhero that changes the world. And it's tied up with a lawsuit, and it's tied up with concepts of what are the rights of the creators. Even because it came out of science fiction, they came out of science fiction fandom. What's the relationship between fandom and the industry, the profession? Who controls the press? Who should be able to have the fruits of their labor? All these questions tied up in with this superhero, and it's part of the myth of comics going back decades. Remember, I was a kid. The Siegel case in the 1970s, there was an early 70s Siegel case, and then there was the letter he sent around protesting the Superman movie. And so this is stuff I'm thinking about. And it just seemed weird to me that the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund only focused on, by the time I was a lawyer and had been in practice for a while and was an academic, only focused on this narrow issue. In fact, I had actually volunteered. Very few people know this, but I actually volunteered to the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund to help them out on some stuff a couple decades ago. And they weren't interested in that. It really was just the First Amendment narrow stuff. So I took a look at their mission statement. And what was fascinating to me is that the mission statement is not about solely the First Amendment. It is not just about censorship. It's about constitutional rights pertinent to, related to freedom of the press, freedom of expression. And when you realize what that is from a legal perspective, again, reading this as a nonprofit lawyer, reading this as a transactional lawyer, that's basically everything when you think about constitutional rights.
Or when you read Bob Sikoriak's Constitution Illustrated.
Which is brilliant. I heard your
my God.
I heard your podcast with that. Your episode with that, which is fantastic. I listened to that, then I went out and got the book. Read the book. It was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And again, talking about all at onceness and things connected. I mean, you have one thing lawyers aren't trained to do is read design environments. They're just trained to read texts, and it ends up becoming a very narrow, linear way of seeing things, and you're missing so much shading and depth. And if anything, I think that book should remind lawyers that law operates inside of design, inside of a design world. It interacts with other forms of expression. It's an incredibly important book. It's something that beyond just explaining the Constitution, but in terms of what law is and how lawyers should think of law. I think that book is incredibly important. So when I was thinking about the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund and looking at its mission, I realized constitutional rights relating to free speech and free expression. Yeah, First Amendment's part of that, but so is copyright, so is contract. When you think about civil rights, most people nowadays think of it in terms of discrimination, which is very important. But what were people discriminated against? What was the legal context in which discrimination was taking place? And you go back to the nation's first federal civil rights law, the Civil Rights Act of 1866. It's about contract. And the idea is that there was only sort of one populace, the white male populace, that had part of the population that had full contract rights. And the other area of the populace did not have those rights to contract. They were slaves, and so they were property. They did not have these contractual rights. And so the Civil Rights Act exists to say, no, you're citizens, you have equal contractual rights. You have all the powers and privileges of being in contracts, and this shall not be abridged. It's a powerful statement related to law. And so when, a couple of years ago, there was a defamation lawsuit where people had gone to the CBLDF for help, and the CBLDF said, actually, we can't help because we only can deal with the First Amendment, and the First Amendment was censorship. It just showed how far afield the whole thing had come, because First Amendment does relate to defamation lawsuits. That's the reason why we have carve-outs in terms of protections where you can say certain things that aren't defamation. Then you go even broader, that whole wonderful area of the Constitution. Copyright is in the Constitution. The right of Congress to regulate trade is in the Constitution. You think about the contract right, which is, there's a contracts clause in the Constitution. Congress can't impair contractual obligations. It's fundamental to who we are, because contracts and the right to agree are very much part of identity construction and free expression. So what the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund had done is they had adopted such a narrow view of their mission statement that they had so much potential that remained to be unlocked, that they could access to be valuable to the community. And they had just decided they weren't going to provide it. Now, that was a mistake. Again, the lawyers who don't read, the new Zachariah book, they tend to get wrapped up in their specialties. They tend to get wrapped up in their narrow focus. And so they end up making these mistakes. And my thought was, we can undo that. So that's why one of the first things I did when I came to the CBLDF was I wrote something for our website. It was a post called Mission What's Possible, where I explained this. I said, we can do a hell of a lot more than we're doing now, and we don't even have to change the articles and bylaws. It's right there in our mission statement. We just haven't thought about what it is that we're really doing.
And it's a horrible question to ask. Is the fund well-funded enough to start expanding in scope, or are you sort of in this kind of rebuilding post-crisis mode? Mm-hmm. And I can find all this stuff. Oh, for me, it's a Form 990. I don't know if C3s have the same. Okay, it's the same thing.
Form 990, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm actually late with mine, but we got an extension through November 15th. So
we're doing that right now too. That's a project for the next few weeks. So it's fun.
Yeah. We could bring the boredom level even higher with that
one. I've actually, there was another interview that hasn't been published yet that I did a couple weeks ago, where a good chunk of it was based on the 990. And that's one of the things that's impressed me about the comics community, is that they take law seriously. I started writing about comics and law back in 2005 with Siegel and the lawsuits over the ownership to Superman and Superboy, when they were trying to terminate the transfer of copyright.
I remember. Yeah,
I'd come across some articles in the mainstream press where people were talking. They confused patent and copyright and trademark, and the Siegels were trying to regain the patent and the copyright. Just stuff that didn't make sense legally. So I thought, there's one thing I can do, is I know a little about law. Went to Yale Law School, been a professor for a while. I can explain this to people, and I read a lot of comics, and I have even though my writing can get a bit abstract, I also can be a bit simple, because I have to explain to myself before I can explain to others. And so I figured I could just maybe make this accessible and simple for other people to understand. And so that's when I started writing about it. And the response was tremendous. So many people read it. They emailed me. They did comments threads and Newsarama and The Beat. And I met a lot of people through it online. And what I found was there was a tremendous, not just hunger and thirst for law, but there's a knowledge of law in comics, because they saw how they could use law to build their own careers, to build their own, to create meaning in life. There's an alignment between, like, if you're a comic artist or if you're a designer and you study the laws, you study the rules of composition, you study perspective, you study how to design a panel or how to do a layout on a page and the interaction of letters and shapes and backgrounds and all that stuff. And you're studying how everything can work together to create an effect. Lawyers, if they understood what they were doing, are doing something very similar. So the comics community gets intuitively what law is really about. And I can say that there are people in the comics community who never went to law school, will never go to law school, but who understand the law a hell of a lot better than many lawyers. And so it's been a real joy for me to be interacting with people. So yeah, I know most people aren't going to want to talk about, part 3, line 8 or something in 990, yeah. But they do. I've been surprised how much people know about 990s or copyright or contracts beyond the average person.
So as far as CBLDF's funding and resources?
Yeah. They actually are in better shape than a lot of nonprofits are now.
Okay.
When one of the first things I did, because, one of the first things you do when you're an executive director, you often organizations hire executive directors to raise money. So one of the first things I did, because I like being counterintuitive, was I arrived in the gig as interim director, and I said, you know what, we're not going to fundraise. In part, we could do that because we had some cushion that was designed to carry the organization through times between, fundraising. And so I was able to do that and keep the organization alive for a period of time. It's not infinite. I mean, running an organization, that the pool of money can disappear very quickly. And nonprofits are feeling this now ever since COVID came out.
Sure.
But it has enough to keep going until we start fundraising again. But it was important to me that we use the time for the near future to rebuild trust. And that involves rebuilding our connections with the comic community and show that we can still provide value to them. And also that it's still a place where they can express what they want, what they need. They can find the answers to their questions. It's something where everybody has a role. So, for example, in our the ethics codes that I'm drafting, it's not simply, here's what you can do, here's what you can't do, and if there's a problem, report it to some faceless committee that will come up with a decision that nobody will trust. The idea is for checks and balances to have checks and balances. So I want to have members of the comics community in the review process so they can keep the review process honest. And if they see that there's an analysis that is designed more to protect the organization than it is to deal with the injustice, the inequities of the situation, then the members of the comics community are there to say, hey, we got to do this the right way. And that's for harassment. That'll be for a number of ethics situations throughout the organization. So it's about being participatory, connected, and helpful to the comics community at large.
Sure. And I mean, you use the term community a lot. That really does characterize what comics is and is about. And to that extent, I mean, there's a serious breach of trust, aspect to your preceding your time there with the crisis that led to all this between the board of CBLDF and comics community. Has there been, communication or thoughts around that and how to, to re-win support or reintroduce the fund in a way that shows it's a new day?
Yeah, and it's interesting that all of this is happening at once in the time of COVID. And
sure.
I'm reminded a bit because it's been an interesting year. And, you and I first met in connection with a memorial service for Tom Spurgeon.
Right.
Who...
I will note that was we held that in January in New York, and we were thinking of doing it in March instead because of people's time frames. And now just how incredibly thankful we are that we did it when we did it before the world ended. But anyway, that's where you and I met.
Yeah, it was an incredible session. Because you had this sense of somebody who was, I think of things in terms of systems. And so you have the elements, the sort of the fixated systems are often called the stock. You have the elements of the system, you have the flow, information flow, and that sort of thing. And then you have the patterns that emerge from it, right? And it's connected with design and all that stuff. When you think of Tom as somebody who was an element in the system, who was this hub of a lot of the information that was flowing from person to person to person, whether it's their careers or knowledge about what's going on in the industry or just, birthdays or how people were feeling in terms of their health or what they were feeling about life. I mean, he was there to connect many people who some of whom he met at conventions, many of whom he didn't meet at conventions. He was this hub for everybody, and then he was gone. And it was this massive shock to the system. And then we went from that, and we're still thinking about that, to COVID, where all of a sudden, I live in New York, which is a system of systems. I don't know if you ever read Rand Koolhaas, Delirious New York, where he talks about, it's there's block after block after block. It's a grid, but each grid has the infinity inside of it, right? And then you have the skyline, everything's playing off of each other. It's this marvelous, dizzying array of elements and flows and emergent patterns. So we had COVID takes all those flows and it just stops them in a day. I mean, literally overnight, they just stopped. And nothing, when you have a dynamic environment and say that there's no interaction among all of the parts, everything collapses very quickly. And so we had something, and there's shock and delirium and people trying to figure out what to do. And lots of strange behavior that can result, like buying rooms full of toilet paper or something like that. I live near a bodega, like so many people do, and that became the hub of bootleg toilet paper from all around the world. So when I think about this, then the CBLDF came, and it was very clear to me that it was the third time I had seen this happen this year. From going from the memorial service where we talk about sort of this glue, this hub of the comics community, to New York, where people are interacting daily, from the subways to lots of things within the block and among the city and within the city, and everything disappears, to this comic book legal defense fund, which had grown out of the comics community, and all of a sudden people realized there was no connection between the fund and the community, and then it had the loss of its as a result of ethics issues at the very top. It's core members of the board left, and the executive director left because of some things that had been done some years past. And then it's in shell shock too. So it's been this recurring thing throughout the year in comics, in the city, in the country, in the world. So coming to the organization, part of one of the things we just had to do, and it's why we were not as public as one might expect for the past 2 weeks, is just wanted to give it some time to work out, what the organization had been through, because we have staff. Most people don't know that. We have a wonderful team that wants to do a lot. And so we've been spending a lot of time talking over the past few weeks. What is it that this organization means to the staff? What does it mean to the community? I've been talking to a lot of people in comics. A lot of people have been emailing me. And so what we're slowly doing is establishing connections through interviews, through social media, and now our programming is about to ramp up in a serious way, as well as we're going to come out with some ethics policies that we're going to present to everybody to take a look at before we actually have them passed, so that everybody can be part of the process of seeing what it is that we're trying to do. So we may not be raising money, but we are quietly doing projects. We actually have been helping out people with books being removed from libraries or classrooms, or they've run into intellectual property issues. I've actually been helping with some things on that. So very quietly, some things nobody knows about. People come to us for help. But we're trying to provide value in a very organic way, as opposed to getting a lot of press for it. And then from those micro interactions, I think some larger patterns of interaction will result.
What have you learned from those interviews and sort of surveys of people, the industry or the community's thoughts about CBLDF?
Mm-hmm. One of them is that's an excellent question, by the way. One of them, there are things that I've learned in terms of the community's awareness of the community's ethical commitments, the community's understanding of the way organizations should be run. One of the things that I like about the way people have been responding into it, let's just talk about the main issue of the room for a while, sexual harassment. I have been working, I went to law school to work with nonprofits, to work with ethics. It's just something I've been obsessed with. I did a PhD in religious history in part because I was trying to figure out, what's the nature of right and wrong, which I can tell all the kids out there never do a PhD with that as your goal. You will not answer it. Or maybe you will, maybe you're smarter than I, but people have been exploring these questions for thousands of years, and I didn't get, it's like, I don't know if you ever saw Doctor Who, Planet of the Spiders, but the thing that kills the third Doctor because of his regeneration is he wants to know everything and realizes that he can't do it, and that actually kills his enemy, because his enemy does get the ability to know everything. So I quickly realized I couldn't know everything about good and evil, so I became a lawyer instead. And the idea was
focusing on evil. I'm just
focusing on evil. Yeah, exactly. If I couldn't be good, I'd be the embodiment of all that was bad.
May as well.
But I was interested in nonprofits and interested in ethics, and it was in the course of my work in that I started helping out some people who were experiencing harassment issues, and I thought the way nonprofits in particular would handle this would be, well, we're all committed to the common good, so we will investigate, we'll find the harasser, and then we'll discipline the harasser and get rid of the harasser and help the people who have been harassed continue to build their careers. And what I found in the nonprofit world, and then in the for-profit world more generally, was that there was a standard way of dealing with these problems, which was the person who complains is a liability risk, therefore they should be disposed of. Right. And in the interest of redemption, and also in the interests of the fundraising for the organization and the reputation of the organization, the harasser will get some kind of discipline, but they will be able to stay. I mean, I've had lawyers tell me that in these cases, and I know this is gendered, but I'm talking 20 years ago, and this is how it was framed. Sure. The woman always leaves. Yeah. Multiple lawyers in multiple cases tell me flat out, the woman always leaves. You just have to accept that. Mm-hmm. But from my perspective, I didn't have to accept that. And so I started fighting. And all of this behind the scenes, sometimes the most effective stuff you can do is without publicity. And the stuff I found just in terms of, this will restore your faith in the law. And I'm getting someplace with the comics community, but I'm sure. Setting this up because the community tapped into something very important. Mm-hmm. I was trying to help somebody with it, and they had a very, very strong case. And the case ended up being dropped. Why did the case end up being dropped? Because the brother of a lawyer on the other side found the spouse of the person who had been harassed and threw the spouse down a staircase and warned that if the case would continue, things would get worse. I was followed, threatened. I found things that I never imagined when trying to help people deal with things. You think as a lawyer, you go, you do pro bono work, you help people, and you do good, particularly in nonprofits. And what I found was this world where not only was the woman always going, or the harassed person more generally always going, and the harasser getting to stay, but when you threatened that system, there was violence that resulted. I mean, I don't mean metaphorical violence. I mean literal violence. And I started working to stop that. And I have gotten, a number of people fired, not the women fired, not the harassed people fired, but I've gotten harassers fired, or, spending more time with their families, the public publicity was maybe much different, but I knew what was going on.
Pursuing other opportunities.
Other opportunities. I've done all of that. And one of the things that I found very encouraging about the comics community was that they had a sense organically that was wrong, and that as much as people were framing what was going on in terms of the standard treatment as, well, this is what the law provides in terms of liability, risk management, and that sort of thing, the comics community got that was unjust. And they got that before a lot of people. I know people talk about the Me Too movement, but if you look at comics, you'll find that the Comics Journal did its article on the previous executive director and arguing that there should have been a dismissal. They talked about that back in 2005. And I can tell you that the atmosphere for that in 2005 was not something that was shared in the rest of the nonprofit world. It was not something that was shared in the rest of the for-profit world. It was an avant-garde position that that sort of action should be taken. And it was an important position coming out of the comics community. The action against harassment of cosplayers, incredibly important in comics conventions. That was going on years before the Me Too movement, where you had the codes of conduct that would be in San Diego and in New York Comic Con as a result of organizations that were saying this has to stop. The Me Too movement was incredibly important, and I was a core part of legal reforms in New York that we started in New York City, and they influenced New York State and influenced other states around the country. But that movement was the groundwork for that movement was something that the comics community helped provide. So to talk to people and to hear how heartfelt they were and how much they cared about ethics policies and how much they wanted to talk to me about ethics policies would be constructed, again, from a lawyer, 501c6, all that stuff, that's important stuff. And so there's an incredible amount of institutional knowledge and institutional concern that I find very encouraging. And it's something that I think when the stuff that I'm drafting goes out to the community at large, you'll see that we have a lot in common. There's also concern with good governance more generally, which, sure, again, the rest of the nonprofit world could learn from. Marshall McLuhan, go back to when I was 4, talked about comic books being a participatory medium. It's something where people read between the panels. It's something where it invites the reader to fill in the blanks. And it's like a cool medium and with TV back when it was black and white and fuzzy. So that idea of comics as a participatory medium carries out in other ways beyond just the act of reading a comic. It's an ethic for all of comics itself. And to find that commitment in people was incredible. I've also been encouraged by the way that there have been people out there who get what I'm trying to do, which I find very gratifying. There are also people who will never want to have anything to do with the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund again. And I get that. As somebody who's worked in harassment behind the scenes for a long time, there are organizations out there that I would love to see burnt to the ground, Sure. But the reality is that there are a lot of the organizations that I would like to see burnt to the ground are very big organizations that have had a number of harassment cases, some big nonprofits, some big for-profits, and they have the money and the institutional infrastructure to have the luxury to survive anything. And I think that in thinking about it, and I've thought about this a lot, that it shouldn't only be the large organizations that get to survive. But that's a personal decision for me, and it's not a personal decision that I would expect people who've gone through this to adopt for themselves. So I get, as much as I appreciate those who are seeing that there is a possibility for redemption as an organization, I also get 100% that there are people who see that that redemption is impossible and it's something that they don't want to see happen. And I fully accept that. And I've said that to people. I get it 100%. And I would say it to anybody who's listening now, I understand it. I empathize with it. And anybody who feels that way has everything, in terms of my heartfelt feeling. I get it. I'm trying to get it. And I wish them well.
Sure. Now, in your introductory note that you mentioned earlier, you also accentuated the interim executive director. Is that a Solon of Sparta sort of thing? What's your definition of interim, and why is it important to not be the permanent director?
Well, I used to be a classicist. It's actually where I started in my undergrad.
No one used to be a classicist. People are always classicists.
That is exactly right. And I'm going to spare you my discussion of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which I always, and rhetoric. I always open my ethics class, so just forget that.
More boring than the Form 990.
No, I promise you it's exciting. I promise you it's really exciting. One of the things that I learned, one of my mentor in undergrad was a professor of rhetoric, the nation's foremost professor of classical rhetoric, George Kennedy. And he knew Derrida personally and had us read, I'm going to be pretentious, had us read Derrida in French. And one of the things he said that most people in the humanities didn't get about Derrida was that he was very funny, and he had this tremendous sense of humor about everything he was saying, that everything in many ways was like a joke, right? There were truth to it, but it was funny. And I getting that sense of playfulness is something that's very important to me in terms of how we interact. So reframe the question again, because I want to pick up where you were before we started talking about Derrida.
Oh, the decision to be interim, and
yes,
what does that mean?
Yes.
And then a pretentious Solon of Sparta reference.
That's why Solon was why I started talking about that. The interim thing is important to me because particularly when there's a breakdown in trust, you're going to suspect the motives of anybody who tries to work with the organization, anybody who tries to help, right? You're thinking about, particularly when you've had an organization where they had an executive director who was there for a long time, over a decade, and you've had board members who were there for a long time. And so you have a sense that people who belong to the organization, and again, whether or not this is what people were feeling, so I'm not accusing anybody of anything, I'm talking just about perception, which is key in rhetoric. You had a perception or a suspicion that people are involved with the organization in part to do whatever the organization does in terms of its mission, but in part to protect their own involvement, to protect their own interests. And with that then becomes a level of distrust of everything that people do. So I wanted to signal from the time I came in that I was not angling for a long-term job. You didn't need to worry about me compromising in order to persuade the board to hire me for more than a few months or for more than a year tops. Because I wasn't going to do that. I'm a transactional. I've been a professor forever, but I've also worked with nonprofits forever. I've done transactional law, and part of the nature of transactional law is you come in, you help, and you leave. That's just the nature of what we do. It's like actors, right? Or freelancers doing a run of a book, a comic. You come in, you do what you're supposed to do, and then you go. So I insisted that I have the title interim because I wanted people to know that I was not doing this in order to be here forever, that I saw this as something where I wanted to leave. Another reason is that I was committed to arguing from the beginning that the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund needed to diversify. The comics has changed. I remember saying to somebody, this is like a decade or so, probably more than a decade or so now, where I was going to a comic convention and I said, wow, one of the great things about this particular year in the comic convention is I don't recognize most of the people. It's for a while you go to a comic convention and you sort of knew everybody, right? I mean, I could name names. I'm sure that you knew the names. But you started seeing people coming in who were teenagers and 20-somethings, people from diverse backgrounds. And it's imperative if you're going to have a participatory nonprofit, if you're going to have a nonprofit that comes out of the community and reflects the community, that it reflects more than the people who were dominating the big two comics community and Comic-Cons back in 1976, right? So we need to move past that. We need to change the composition of who we are as an organization. And it seemed to me to be just inconsistent to say, oh, I want you to diversify, and the first thing you need to do is hire me permanently. I mean, that's, come on. I mean, I am a white male from Pennsylvania, German descent, Amish country. Maybe a century ago, back when my German people were in Pennsylvania were suspected of being, spies of the Kaiser, we might have had some sort of claim for being part of a marginalized community. Something people were still talking about in the 70s, by the way.
Really?
But now, no, I do not have any claim to that. And so it was important to send the signal that I was committed to diversification. And part of that was not putting myself up for the permanent top job.
Nice. Yeah, I remember, again, same with you, going to festivals and cons, and I had a multi-year break from that. And when I returned, it was discovering not just the younger generation, but also the online comics people who I knew absolutely nothing about, and saw these lines like 100 people long. To see them, I'm like, I clearly, I've Rip Van Winkled on this. I've missed an entire generation, and it's awesome. There's no sense of, oh, you goddamn kids when I was young, blah blah blah. I mean, there's always that. We're going to carry that with us for the rest of our days. But yeah, that sense of, the proliferation of voices and diversity really is amazing within comics. So, I'm hoping CBLDF comes around to reflecting that also, like you said.
The time that I'm here, I'm dedicated to doing that. And I'm dedicated to doing that in the board membership, staff, through just, again, everybody participating in the organization and what the organization is going to do. So there's some structural things that I'm working on that I think will be clear, hopefully as soon as November, things that I'm building to make that happen. But it's something I'm committed to. It's particularly when something's about law, we have to have an organization where people feel that they're part of it. People don't trust law if they feel that the legal system's attached from them in some way. Yeah. I wrote years and years ago, when I was first starting out as a professor, I wrote this article called Design Jurisprudence in the Nonprofit Style. I believe it was the first article of what we would now call design thinking in the law, and influenced a lot of it was by my comic stuff and other stuff I've been reading. The one thing it differed from the design thinking in law stuff today is a lot of what people talk about in design thinking in law is just empathy, figuring out what the client wants. And I get there's some people in design thinking, they talk about that, there's certain courses in design thinking where that's the emphasis, because that's what people can understand. It's a lot harder to talk about composition. It's a lot hard to talk about physical space and the dynamics of physical space. And even getting into math for crying out loud, than it is to say, Betazoid, Consular Troy, I empathize with you, I feel you, so that kind of design thinking is not what I'm getting at. It's more sort of organic to the relationship of rules and transformation. But one of the things that I write about was sort of the origins of perspective and how Leon Battista Alberti, who also worked in law and diplomacy and government, as well as explaining the mathematics of perspective, describes the civic assembly in terms of 3-point perspective. He says, this is this line, and you look in this line, and it goes through all of the individuals and what they represent, and it creates this multi-dimensional body, this multi-dimensional form that goes beyond any individual, all the points of which it's composed. And it was a beautiful metaphor for me, and sort of this intersection of design and law that still affects everything I do now. So when I think about redesigning the CBLDF, that's very much in my mind. How can we go from something that has been seen as identified with its executive director, identified with its board, and just this very sort of Cyclopsian mission, this univalent mission, to something that brings all of us together in an organization that goes beyond any one person, that brings in the interconnection of all of the concerns connected with law in the comics community, law and self-regulation, law and norms, law and ethics. I think we can do it. It's a daunting task, but what happened organically in the 80s, I think, is something that we can take to another level in the 2020s. So I'm very hopeful that it's something that we can build. I know we have a tremendous, tremendous depth of design knowledge in the comics community, and I'm hoping I can draw from that in terms of organizational design as well.
I look forward to seeing it. And, if I can help in any way, shape, or form, outside of being an itinerant podcaster and a registered lobbyist with the feds.
Lobbying is very important. And I'd love to hear more. You do.
Trust me, I have an all caps note here that says Gil's antitrust story, which I will share with you either on or off mic.
Oh, please do. Please do. I want to hear the story.
Let me tell you. We'll go right into it now with a 501c6 thing. Now, keep in mind, I have no legal background, no regulatory governance or anything like that. I'm unqualified for everything I've ever done.
That's great.
But I'm smart and I can speak well, so people are fooled. Early on, when I launched the trade association in 2014, I was pitching all these companies at this big trade show sort of event in New York City. And I've got a whole bunch of guys on board already because they're companies who've known me for 15 years through the magazine work I was doing. They're on board. And they're primarily North American. So I pitched this one pharmaceutical-related company that is from Northern Europe, explain trade association, we're going to approach FDA, we're going to do this, this, and this. And the CEO says to me, so, Gil, how would we use this to create barriers to entry for our competitors? And I'm just staring at him across the table like, yeah, we don't say that in America. I mean, I know every regulation has winners and losers, but we're not explicit about that. And a day later, I asked another Northern European company in the same space, and they asked a variant of the same question. And I thought to myself, I'm going to stick with North America, maybe UK. I'm staying away from Europe for a while. I don't think they get antitrust the way I get antitrust, because I'd put together in this handout with all the goals and missions, and it was advocating for the regulatory, legislative, and general business interests of this sector. And I joked with people that I was going to change new number one priority was Gil does not go to prison or get subpoenaed. And then number two, advocate for the regulatory, legislative, and general business interests. Well, yeah, I ran into that at the beginning and mentioned to the first law firm that I was working with down in Washington on this stuff. They were like, yeah, we have an antitrust boilerplate statement we can give you that you can read before every meeting to make sure everybody understands what you can and can't talk about. But yeah, there've been little moments since then where someone says, it would be great if we all got together. And I was like, no, we don't all get together and decide on X. We can't do that. That's not something that a trade association is permitted to do.
It's a tough thing to explain in the comics community, for example. And I know I got some heat from this when I was advising. I write on my own, or I do interviews with reporters on this sort of thing. And I know that one of the things that people in comics want to do is create a union. But the complicating factor is that many people in comics and the people who want to be part of a union are not employees, which means that if you have people who are not employees joining together and, say, setting contractual prices, that's kicking you right legally into antitrust territory. Yeah. And so it's not that I'm opposed to what they want to do. All for it. Great. Take your power and use it. It's just that the legal system is not set up to help that. It's designed to punish that, and coming up with more creative ways. Like we helped actually models do this through nonprofit organizations in the sexual harassment space. I was an associate director of the Fashion Law Institute, which is the world's first organization on the intersection of law and fashion. And harassment, because it's a concern of ours in the organization, it was something we very quickly wanted to help deal with by redesigning fashion shows. So we held our own fashion shows and did different ways of designing it to minimize, say, women being photographed while changing and that sort of thing, models being photographed while changing. And also we wanted to help people develop new standards for the industry. And so we co-founded an organization called the Model Alliance, and one of my students actually co-founded, and we helped out an organization that also helps models report harassment and get psychological help if they have been harassed and deal with the trauma. So it's been something that we've been working with for a while. But one of the challenges that we face is that when the first anti-harassment action in the fashion industry was like a century ago, and it was done by labor unions trying to get protection, and they could do it because they had certain legal protection. And you have to be a bit more creative if you're trying to do some of the similar things for freelancers. So I'm hoping that some of my experience in that space is something that I can bring to comics as well, to help with harassment, to help with contractual issues, to help people want to get fair pay, they want to get a stake in their work. Let's figure out ways to do that while avoiding some of the weird legal problems that can result just by the historical accident that you're not employees. So this stuff gets me. But I have a question for you, if I can ask, if that's okay.
I always tell people this is a conversation, not an interview, but nobody ever takes me seriously.
No, I do. So because I've listened to a bunch of your podcasts, but you have a lot of podcasts, and I haven't caught up from the very beginning.
I don't even listen to them anymore. That's okay.
No. I'm going to look. You have Milton Glaser, you have Stephen Heller. I've listened to I'm like this greatest hits of people in comics and design. I mean, it's like this is it's one thing for me to read the books. It's another thing to hear these voices. And you got Glazer right before he passed, which was stunning.
Oh God.
That to talk about that was, a legacy in an interview. It was fantastic.
Yeah.
So, but how, I've talked about how, somebody who is interested in comics and ethics and Marshall McLuhan and design, gets into law. But how does someone with your background get into doing what you do? Because that fascinates me. Because I love
the day job stuff.
Yeah, the day job stuff.
Oh, okay. Complete accident. I come out of St. John's College in 1995 with a master's in liberal arts, so classics background. Start associate editor on 2 business-to-business magazines, Juvenile Merchandising and Auto Laundry News, the car wash industry trade journal,
Great.
Of which there were 3. Because one of the first lessons I learned in that space was anytime one guy makes a dime in any business-to-business sector, 2 more guys will chisel in for a nickel. So there were 3 major car wash trade magazines. From there, left the company, went to another one, working on household and personal products for a magazine. Then they moved me over to a cosmetic packaging magazine, for which, again, no background. And then 2 people came over to our company with the idea for a magazine about pharmaceutical outsourcing. And their editor got cold feet. And so they jumped, not knowing who was going to edit their magazine. They were both salespeople. And within our company, they said, Gil's smart. He can figure this out. And I did. I taught myself how the pharmaceutical contract manufacturing and development space works. I got good relationships with a lot of, we call them CDMOs, contract development and manufacturing organizations, built good relationships with them, taught myself as much as I could about drug pipelines, FDA, all this other stuff. Realized at one point that no one on the inside knew all this stuff either. Like I always, any situation, I assume everybody else knows more than I do. And then I come to realize, wait a second, nobody knows what this acronym means, and they don't understand why this happened. Oh, we're all on the same footing. There is a lobbyist version of this that I will tell you off mic that was the key to my overcoming imposter syndrome in recent years. But after 15 years running the magazine, I had the idea that this industry really needed an advocate. And I thought at the time I would just organize them, hand off the association to someone in Washington who could represent them. And over the next 10 months after I first got industry support for it, but before I officially formed it, I realized if I don't quit the magazine, I'm never going to get all these guys organized. And, I'm at 42 at that point, and I thought, going on 43, and I thought, I don't want to be 50 and discover magazines are gone and I've got nowhere to turn, et cetera. So midlife crisis, I quit the job over Christmas. I came up with a decision end of 13, started recruiting companies in 2014 and filed for 501c6 and never looked back. From there, I discovered I honestly didn't think I would have to become a lobbyist. I thought I was just going to be FDA facing. And then the first time the lobbying firm I was working with, the first one I worked with, took me around DC, around Capitol Hill. We finished, and then they said, well, congratulations, Gil. You've now passed a threshold for the number of policy meetings you can hold in a quarter, so you need to register as a lobbyist with the feds. I'm like, you sons of bitches, you're supposed to protect me from that. So I'm now, in fact, this happened. I contributed to Biden's campaign this summer, this summer. And there was about 3 or 4 contributions in when they wrote me like, are you the same Gil Roth who's registered? I'm like, yep. They're like, we're not accepting contributions from lobbyists. I'm like, I didn't even think of that. I'm really sorry. So they returned everything.
Yeah, I heard that in the Marco interview. That made me laugh out loud, actually. I thought that was funny.
Yeah, it was just so funny. I was like, I just thought, I would kick in some cash. But so I've given to the DNC and individual candidates who can or are willing to accept dirty money from me. But yeah, no background whatsoever. And yet what I've learned is if you care about learning, you can go a pretty long way. I care about understanding, same as you, why systems work the way they do, how they ended up this way, what can be fixed and what can't. Honestly, the big reason we came into existence was to negotiate this multi-billion-dollar user fee with the FDA. And I never negotiated a car price before this, but I got inside. We managed to convince FDA to bring us in with these other industry groups. And I found, I could understand everyone's motivations. Didn't understand all the terminology and some of the, the technical issues that companies were dealing with, but I understood, what the leverage points were and how to get what we needed without screwing over anyone else.
Right.
Now, I wasn't physically threatened the way you were in the harassment cases. I was introduced as that pain in our ass Gil Roth by another trade association at their annual meeting. And I thought, I earned that. That's fine. I will tell you from an antitrust point, though, during that negotiation 5 years ago with the agency, they asked at one point, so, Gil, can you tell us how your members handle the user fees that are applied? Do they get their customers to pay them, or, do they have to pay them directly? And I said, I'll need that from you in writing, and I'll need to pass that by counsel, because asking my members what their business practices and pay schedules and how that's an antitrust. They completely blanched at the negotiating table. I'm like, I said the same thing. I'm not fooling around here. I'm not going to prison.
Right.
I'm not going to start asking my guys for confidential business info that gets to the FDA and somehow gets out, and I end up getting screwed.
We've had in fashion, we've had organizations raided, by antitrust officials in Europe and the UK. It's incredible.
Yeah. And I just figured, okay, I don't know too much, but I'm going to err on the side of caution with all these things. But yeah, I came at this with no background. I have no pharmaceutical or scientific background, but I always tell people my X-Men mutant superpower is schmoozing.
Mm-hmm.
And,
That's a great superpower. I envy that.
Oh, yeah. It works wonders. I'll tell you off mic another boring story about this that led to my figuring out something important several weeks before anybody else knew it. But anyway, yeah, that's the story. I have no qualifications, but I was interested and crazy enough to organize an industry that has so many disparate business models that no one would even think to bring them all together. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, I admire people who can do that, because I am more like, and I was much like this in law school, I'm like Owatu, the watcher, except I wore pants, I'm very interested in learning how humans talk and interact, because it's not something that I learned naturally. I mean, when I went to elementary school, they said, oh, you could learn, you're ahead of this stuff, you can learn by yourself. So my elementary school was sitting in the back of the room writing my own lessons and tests, which is not really good for social development. It was great in terms of learning stuff, but it wasn't great in terms of human talk. So I admire that, and I wanted to ask, because again, your podcast is addictive, because from my perspective, I love comics, I love design. You interview the best people. I love cities and systems, like your Michael Musta thing, and think about how New York evolves and sort of stuff. How do you see these parts of your life flowing into each other or shaping each other in different ways? Do you see them as separate?
In certain ways, yeah, but it's more in terms of practice and technical stuff. Mm-hmm. Like, there was a point where I worried that my trade association board was going to say, hey, Gil, the podcast is taking away from your time. I know it's not, even though we're doing this on a Friday afternoon. They're not listening. But the ability to get up and talk in front of a congressional committee or during a big FDA public meeting or anything without any hesitation, I couldn't have done that without the years of experience of doing this. Mm-hmm. There was a moment in 2014, when I had to go up during an open comment session at a big FDA meeting, and I was nervous, but I thought, I got up at the podium, and it took about a second or two, and then I thought, Gil, there's a microphone in front of you. There's a microphone in front of that FDA guy. You do this every friggin' week for the show, and it's usually somebody you've never met. Go. And, I realize part of it is you realize you learn more than you thought you knew once you start talking. But yeah, so it's helped in that respect. There have been aspects where, I've come to learn more about the nature of change and people. And it's something that, ties into where CBLDF is in terms of whether redemption exists. Mm-hmm. I'll bore you immensely. This morning in my journal, I was writing about the commissioner of the FDA. Mm-hmm. I normally don't write about work, but the new commissioner was a non-political guy. He gets hired after a very competent commissioner retired, Scott Gottlieb. And Han comes in, suddenly the pandemic happens. He is blindsided by some of this stuff. He does a couple of things that are White House driven that aren't good for FDA. Mm-hmm. And there apparently was a come to Jesus moment for him where he's now done a 180 and is basically shielding the FDA from White House pressure and, making sure the enhanced standards for vaccines are followed and doing other stuff. And the White House is pissed off. The head of HHS wants him fired. And I look at it and I think there was a moment where that guy looked around and thought, who am I going to be remembered as? Mm-hmm. When he had the deer in the headlights thing, yeah, you go along to get along. But there was a moment when he, I think, had this instant of the FDA is much bigger than me. Mm-hmm. And if I, as its commissioner, betray its principles, you don't win that back easily. And I think he had a change and knows that, this isn't driven by the polls, election looks bad. This is something where he's doing something that could clearly damage his career, get him fired and lambasted by the president. And yet he's going ahead and protecting the scientists and protecting the process at the agency. It's, something I'm interested in, that question of whether people change.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's absolutely vital. Yeah. It's funny you mention that because I was thinking about this completely unconnected with this interview. Something I think about a lot, from whether you think about Neil Gaiman's Sandman or Doctor Who, which, I was lucky enough to see before it hit PBS. It was a year in the United States coming out of Philadelphia, Channel 17, UHF channels, if you remember UHF.
Oh, it was on Channel 9 here in New Jersey. It was WOR, but yeah, it was non-PBS.
They did the Pertwee first year, and then it disappeared, and I'd be, like a little maniac explaining to my friends, it's just an amazing show. It's not on TV anymore, but I got to see this again. But, my favorite line, bar none, is the transition from the fifth to the sixth Doctor, where he recovers from regeneration, and Perry asks him, his assistant asks him, Dr. Deck, what happened? He goes, change, my dear, and not a moment too soon. It's like that change is absolutely key. And it's part of the reason why comics are such an appeal to me. And I mentioned the Batman thing in Batman 1966, but I don't know why these things came together, but my parents got me the great comic book Heroes from Jules Pfeiffer. They got me Batman from the 30s to the 70s, Superman from the 30s to the 70s. And then they also got me, this was the one that kicked me into collector land, was Batman 256, which was like Batman through the 30s, 40s, 50s, and it was 100-page giant. So it was stories from each decade. And I grew up in Amish country on a hill. It's like Hobbiton. And my family came, and like the Trexlers came in the 1700s and just stayed in one place. Once they left the Hudson River Valley to go to Pennsylvania, they stayed in this one place in Pennsylvania. And so the hill, most of the people on the hill were related to me on either my father or my mother's side. And so I see people almost like, because my spouse says we all look alike in that area, and it's very true. All like, I used to joke that the reason I left was it was illegal for me to marry anybody in my hometown. But we all tended to look alike because it was a bunch of families that intermarried for centuries, literally centuries. Mm-hmm. So I tend to view people, because we live on a hill and it was multi-generational, almost like a video slider. When you're editing a video, you can kind of move through the movie, and only it's like I kind of see people sort of where they are now in life and where they'll be like 20 years from now, because it's just age and life and a process. And you can slide back and forth because we were all like homogeneous and looking alike and doing the same things in life, and like everybody existed on this kind of slider. So comics had that, and it fascinated me that you could have this character like Batman, and who could be, one thing in the 1930s when he first appears, and then another thing in the 40s, and then another thing in the 50s with the weird sci-fi, and then the camp stuff in the 60s, and then Neil Adams, who I was and Jim Aparo, who I was obsessed with in the 1970s, getting everything I could get for them, or Jack Kirby, and that was the age of the New Gods and Commandy, where I was absolutely obsessed with. But you could see these characters who were one thing, right? They were one person, but they had so many radically different ways of existing in yet having a coherent identity throughout. That to me is fascinating for comics, and it's a lot about, to me, it was a lesson about life, that it's possible to design yourself in different contexts. It's possible to design organizations in different contexts. It's valuable not to get too attached to one thing, because societies change, people change, and the ability to retain the core of who you are is going to be connected with your ability to change as society evolves. So, when I talk about comics community and something that is meaningful to me, because it's something I've been reading about in my Owatu the Watcher way since the 1970s, but it's also something that I see if this medium is going to survive, it needs to be able to change. It needs to be able to evolve in ways that reflect changes in the media, because media are not stable. They don't stay fixed. It needs to react to difference in the composition. It's a wonderful part of the reason it's such an attraction to outsiders is that it's this medium where pretty much anybody can jump in without a huge investment of capital, now more than ever, in terms of exercising their creative talents and possibly, if not build a career in it, at least have it a meaningful part of their life and something that isn't a drain on their existence. And being able to bake in change into an organization is very important to me, just as being able to bake in change into one's own life. Absolutely key. So it's really encouraging for me to hear you say that. That understanding is absolutely vital.
Yeah, it's something one of the first public speaking things I ever had to do. My late 20s, they wanted me to talk at my old college, Hampshire College, a hippie trippy school in Western Mass, about, I guess, working in publishing, because I was doing trade magazines at that point. And I looked out over about 20 Hampshire students who were all a bunch of hippies and all that. And I just said, the lesson I learned at like 28 or 29 was don't focus too tightly on anything as a field of study in college, because you might be lucky and get a job in it when you finish, and you're going to hate it within 3 or 4 years. So learn how to learn how to be, open and flexible and understand, how change is coming and what it's going to mean. This is all 1999, before everything went, as nuts as it did with the internet. But yeah, it was, even then I had this sense of, who you think you are is not who you are. You need to keep refreshing that, or keep regenerating. That's
keep regenerating. Absolutely key. Well, let me ask you a question.
I've turned into Peter Capaldi. It's great. Sorry, go on.
Who is absolutely fantastic. The Heaven Sent one is one of my favorite things of all time, where he's trying to get through that wall. If you haven't seen that, I strongly recommend it.
Check it out.
The question I have for you is, so we started off talking about the CBLDF, and you obviously have been connected with comics and you've seen comics industry change and that sort of thing. What would you think that I should be thinking about or doing or considering as I work in this? Because, I've talked to a lot of people. I haven't talked to you about it. And I'd be very interested in hearing your perspective as somebody who knows a lot more people than I.
I'll have to think about it, because it's one of the things that struck me, over the last year, and it's something you brought up in this conversation. Without Tom, everything changes. My life, I don't, and again, COVID hit, a few months later, but without just the way that Tom Spurgeon would just, drop me a line about something and it would open up my world to this artist or that work, et cetera. I don't have that exposure that I once did. And it's been interesting to me. And Eric Reynolds and I at Fanta have talked about how fitting it is that it happens coincidentally that without Tom, there are no festivals or cons held for a year, that, coincidentally, none of us are going anywhere or seeing anybody. I'll have to think about what I would want to see from a CBLDF. It's part of what I wanted out of this conversation, is just to understand really, what it can do, what it's intended to do, and the way it can grow and serve the comics community.
What I've been telling people, just to give you a sense, and this is very much how I see it, and it's connected to the work I've done in fashion. It's work I've done in entertainment and and even in nonprofits, is that one of the questions I got from a number of people in private conversation was, why aren't you just taking the money that the organization has, give it to another charity and fold?
Right.
And and I think, but then the one that came up the most common was the Heroes Initiative, which does really great stuff. The one that they have about Liechtenstein making millions and the comic artist not making, just getting enough money for a glass of wine. That is something that is so human and so profound and so meaningful, where you see the value of groceries and a glass of wine. There's something so profound in that I love what they do, and I hope they do more of it. But at the same time, as somebody who's worked in law and done a lot to give away legal services for free or very, very, very low cost, unlike a lot of lawyers, it just seems weird to me that something that everybody needs to know and can use as a tool to succeed is only, the best legal work is only accessible to the people with the most money. Remember, I come from Amish country, and very strong sense of right and wrong and very strong sense of being an outsider. I grew up feeling like in some way that I was cheated, because I grew up in farm country, and the people who were interested in the stuff I was interested in, a lot of them went to big cities, and I got to meet people and read about kids who were doing all these wonderful adventures and going to college early or going to special, they were making movies and doing stuff. And I'm sitting in farm country where half my class leaves to go, work in the fields once they turn 14. And it just felt like a cheat. But then next door to me, across the street from me where my mom worked, was this place called the Lutheran Home. And the Lutheran Home also had, it was a place where they would take kids who were sent from their families, and a lot of it was from Philadelphia, and a lot of it was minority kids, it was Black and Hispanic kids, and it was and our best family friend was the person who was the head of the organization, and so I spent a lot of time over there with the kids in their place, and got to know them and got to know how insanely bright a number of these people were, just really smart, and also got to see a situation where a number of them were being removed from their homes for things that I would see in my largely white community going on, but those kids weren't being taken from their homes. And it just got me the sense of however cheated I felt about growing up in farm country and not having access to what kids in New York could have if they wanted to do things with movie cameras or whatever it is they wanted to learn, or philosophy, which we weren't having in my school, or calculus at a young age, which we didn't have in my school. These kids had it even worse, and so I thought, and it was really unfair. I mean, they were taken from their homes, and they were denied access even to what back in I don't want to use the language, but my introduction to kindergarten. We actually, in the 1969, 1970, when I started kindergarten, it was still segregated in my part of Pennsylvania. The kids who went who came into the home, they would come to my elementary school, but they would be taught at a different time, and they weren't allowed to mingle with us. I mean, it was sort of the last vestige of segregated education. And it was, and we were actually told in much more colorful ways not to let our lips touch the water fountains, because the kids from the home would touch it with their lips, and we couldn't have that pollution. And I mean, these were our family friends. I was like, what is this? This is just this weird place that I've entered, right? And again, the sense that there were people out there who, as unfair as I felt, who had it 20 times more unfair than just being a kid growing up in farm country. So for my work, a lot of what I do is about giving people the tools to succeed, and the tools that other people can have without effort, or can buy because they happen to have a lot more money or advantage coming into this in. So when I think about the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund and what it can do, I think it is amazing that Hero Initiative and other charities are out there in order to help creators who've fallen into hard times. That's vital, important, especially given the history of the industry. But I think the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund could be an organization that can give creators the tools to avoid that fate, to make sure that never happens to them. If they understand contracts, if they understand copyright, if we can get them to, free or low-cost legal support that would cost, companies tens of thousands of dollars that they could afford to pay. If we could get them that support so that they can build their little companies and make them into something big, they can get their comic and give it intellectual property protection and make sure they have contracts that give them money as opposed to most of the money going somewhere else. We, as a legal defense fund, can do that. That is within our mission. That is about fulfilling constitutional rights and making sure that everybody has civil rights in terms of everybody, in a non-discriminatory fashion. Everybody has the ability to enter into these agreements and get the full benefits of being of these agreements. This is something we can do, and it's something we have forgotten. It's something we have not done, and I am determined that that will never happen again. That if by the end of the year, I've talked a lot about distributed workflow and making sure the staff are doing things and making sure the comics community is doing stuff for us. So it's not just the executive director, that's part of it. But another big part of it, beyond sort of the mechanics of operation, is to make sure that we use law to give everybody power. We use law to give everybody the ability to do what they want to do and to benefit from the thing that they're creating, and to make sure that what they create is accessible to everybody to read and to learn from, and then to create their own things and then use law to build their own careers, to find meaning in their own lives. I mean, that to me is what it's about. That to me is what law is about. And overcoming that unfairness, which is something we've been talking about in comics since the 1930s, if not before. If I can help people do that, and if I can help the Comic Legal Defense Fund become a force for good in that way, then I think these few months will be well spent. So I really hope that's something we can do.
I'm ready to run through a wall for you in full Hulk cartoony juggernaut manner, because it is comic books, but
Hulk, Kool-Aid Man, whatever,
Yeah, Juggernaut, and put the big helmet on.
We're all these.
Yeah. Thanks so much for coming on. I look forward to, seeing the next steps for CBLDF, and, if there's any way I can help, including weird lobbying connections, I'll do my best.
I will talk to you about that, because it's incredibly important. And it's part of, it's the nature of the system, the way it works. I mean, I've done some of it myself over the years. And it's an interesting, Congress is an interesting place. Do you ever ride the subway?
I've seen it, but I've never gotten to ride on the inter-building subway. No.
And the presidential bowling alley.
I heard about it, but haven't seen it.
Dude, we gotta.
Well, that's part of my. I've seriously contemplated just taking the train down to Washington and walking around just to do that again. I'm like, I'm getting kind of weird about working from home all this time. I'm like, I would just drive to Newark and just take the train, walk for an hour or two, get back on the train and come home, just to get out. But, that's just a recipe for disaster.
It'll happen again with masks. It'll get back there because people have to connect. They really do. Just like we'll get back to conventions again. They'll just be somewhat different.
Someday I will be sitting across a table from you doing a follow-up podcast.
That would be a blast. I would really enjoy that. This has been, awesome. I've learned a lot from you in this, and it's given some new dimensions. I'm only saying this to you because you were talking about stuff in your career, and I know, again, everybody else, tune out. This is
like I always say, don't worry, nobody's listening.
Okay, good. It's like just last night in my class, again, I was talking about trade associations, and we were actually talking about trade association magazines and industry magazines, and how, for a period of time, it's like you could imagine any function in any industry, and it had a magazine for it.
3. I say,
3, like you were saying. Exactly.
People are always surprised. There's a car wash industry mag. I'm like, no, there are 3 car wash industry mags because one guy made a dime in it. It's the same thing with pharmaceutical outsourcing. We launched the magazine, and then pharma outsourcing came out, and American Pharmaceutical Outsourcer came out because everybody realized, there's a market for this. We need to make editorial, and we'll be good.
Did you ever talk to Steve Young about industrial musicals?
No.
Oh my word! He's He used to work for the David Letterman Show. He was a writer for the David Letterman Show. He did The Bathtubs Are Coming, which is a great documentary. I think it's on Netflix now.
It's in my wish list. I've got that on my watch list. Yeah,
definitely worth doing. And if you ever need an interview, I would strongly recommend talking to him, because the intersection of sort of business and promotion of various lines of business, and even trade associations are connected to this tangentially, and just finding meaning in life. It's a tremendous documentary, and everything he's done, the book he wrote, the albums he put together, and this documentary is fantastic. And it all connects with the sort of stuff that you were talking about in your line of work. So if I can leave with one recommendation, it would be a fun conversation, I think he'd be it.
Cool. I'll look for the connection.
All right.
Jeff, thanks so much for coming on.
All right. No, thank you. Thank you.
And that was Jeff Trexler. Like I said, pretty far-ranging conversation, but I hope you got a lot out of it. You can find more about Jeff at his site, jefftrexler.com, and can follow him on Twitter at Jeff Trexler. In both cases, that's JEFFTREXLER. There'll be links to that in the show and episode notes for this one. And you can find out more about the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund at cbldf.org. Again, there'll be links. Now, in the before time, this is when I would ask you guys for support for the podcast through my Patreon or PayPal. Those still exist, but I'm not asking for money. As far as support goes, just send me an email, send me a postcard, send me a letter. Let me know what you like and don't like about the show. If you have any money to spare, I'd really prefer that you gave it to people in need. Those can be artists and writers who have Kickstarters, GoFundMes, Indiegogos, Patreons, whatever. They can be non-artists and non-writers, just normal people. If you're not comfortable giving to individuals, then there are plenty of institutions in need. Local food banks, freedom funds, and more. Depending on your feelings about it, there's also the CBLDF. They are a nonprofit, so it's a tax-exempt contribution you can make there. All I'm saying is there are a lot of people and a lot of causes that can use a hand right now, so if you're in a position to help, then please help. Now, last thing, I do still have some copies left of the very first issue of my very first zine, Haiku for Business Travelers. I got a really nice note about it this morning from a past guest, and it's guilting me into getting to work on issue number 2, which I was hoping to have done by Thanksgiving. But again, the neurosis and anxiety and everything else we talked about at the top of this episode is kind of stymieing that stuff. But I still have copies left of issue number 1, so it is free. If you're interested, just drop me a line and say, hey, Gil, send me a copy of Haiku for Business Travelers. Or hit up haikuforbusinesstravelers.com. There's a form there you could fill out. I'll just need your mailing address. Again, it's free. If you want to kick in a couple of bucks for postage, production, or whatever, you can do that. But really, this is just a way for me to share my art, such as it is. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.